May these words be spoken and heard in the power of love. Please be seated. Well, here we are, early in the 40 days of Lent for 2021. And as always, on the first Sunday in Lent, the Gospel is one of the stories, one of the versions of Jesus being tested in the wilderness. As Mark tells the story, immediately, and that's one of Mark's favourite little joining words, immediately after his baptism, Jesus goes out into the wilderness area to spend 40 days in solitude and prayer. And indeed, as Mark chooses the words to tell his story, he says the Spirit drove him out, sort of the Spirit expelled him out from the Jordan Valley into the dry areas of the Judean wilderness. As we might expect, if you've been listening to my sermons or done any other theological studies, the Gospel of John has a totally different version of events, and there's not even a hint of Jesus withdrawing from public view after his baptism. He simply meets up with his first disciples. Remember the stories of Philip and Andrew and Nathaniel? And they get on with the work. And you can see that in John chapter 1 from verse 29 through to the end of the chapter. In the story told by Mark, which was followed by both Matthew and Luke, we get the story of the testing, or as we often call it, the temptation of Jesus. Mark is casting Jesus into the role of a great hero who's been sent on a quest. Usually it's to win the princess and beat off the dragons and various other things. And before the hero can achieve that mission, he must first overcome various trials and tests. And then he's able to proceed and successfully complete the mission. We know that hero's story really well. There are hundreds of examples of it in our repertoire of stories and of film and of theatre. And it was a common theme in Old Testament times, including in Jewish literature, Jewish culture around the time of Jesus. They believed that Abraham had overcome 10 different tests, and there's a whole tradition after the Old Testament and before Jesus about Abraham's 10 tests. Moses, of course, inflicts 10 plagues on Egypt, 10 demonstrations of his power, God's power, before Pharaoh agrees to let the people go. Again, according to the rabbinic teachers, that Moses was tested 10 times in the wilderness by the stubbornness and the difficult nature of the tribes of Israel. And then, of course, when Moses goes up the holy mountain, he's given not 12 commandments, but 10 commandments. There's a bit of a theme going on here. John tells a different kind of story when he writes about Jesus. For John, Jesus is not the hero sent on a mission, but the divine Son of the Father who descends from heaven to earth to reveal the truth, to shed light in darkness, after which he will return to heaven. And we hear that over and over and over again as we read through John's Gospel. And we know that story well also. We know it in our Superman comics, for those of us of a certain age, and we know it from our superhero movies for the younger ones. So the earliest Christians used different kinds of stories about Jesus in order to express what he meant to them, and also to try to figure out a way of describing Jesus that would make sense to other people. Mark and Matthew and Luke are doing it in a way that kind of reflects the biblical way of telling stories, while John is describing Jesus in a way that would make sense to people who were embedded in Greek mystery religions and were fascinated by the philosophical, metaphysical contrasts of light and dark, flesh and spirit. That's the kind of language we find in John's Gospel. We don't need to worry about these differences in the storytelling, and there's certainly no need to try and explain them away or to harmonise them into a mishmash with no contradictions. I love that word, mishmash. Just the very sound of it tells you what the word means. It's all mushed together. And that's often what we've done, of course, with Sunday school. Rather, we can take these different ways of talking about Jesus in the Gospels as biblical permission for us to keep fashioning new stories about Jesus, stories which express what he means to us in the kind of world we actually live in and to other people who share that world with us. Whether or not Jesus actually spent 40 days where the wild things are, the story about him doing so inspired many other Christians, particularly the mothers and the fathers of the desert, to do similar things. And of course, the idea of 40 days in the wilderness created the concept of Lent itself. So I'm inviting you to think of Lent as a time for imagination rather than as a time to pull out a list of kind of spiritual resolutions from a year or so back and dust them off and look for a set of rules to be ticked off. And for your imagination this Lent, let me offer 3 lenses, 3 windows through which you might let your imagination run loose in the quest during Lent for new and better ways to be followers of Jesus. So we're going to talk about the old-fashioned stuff of fasting, praying and giving. Fasting, or as I like to paraphrase it, embracing. And straight away, there's 2 different ways, 2 sides of the same coin there. We all know about Lent as a time to give up chocolate or red meat or wine or whatever it is that we think we enjoy too much and it can't be good for us. But what if we imagine Lent as a time to slow down, a time to embrace, time to hold close rather than rush on by to the next thing? For sure, we can benefit by giving up busyness. We've even had some practice of that in the past year, thanks to COVID. So perhaps we can claim that as a gift, a spiritual gift snatched out of a wreckage of a year which has already seen more than 110 million people infected by the virus and more than 2.5 million dead. Slowing down wasn't easy and it took us by surprise, but it had some positive benefits. For the people in Delhi, for the first time in years, they could see the snow in the Himalayas because the air was clean. Makes you realize what a mess we've made of things. So what if we choose to go slow between now and Easter? Not to multiply expectations, I've got to achieve this, I've got to do this, I've got to pray this amount of time, but rather choosing which particular activities we're going to drop for now and which ones we're going to focus on. By surrendering some of the busyness and some of the speediness, we may find time to be more attentive to God, to each other, and to ourselves. And so that brings us to prayer, the second theme, if you like, of Lent. Prayer, or simply mindfulness. When we are more attentive, we shall naturally be more prayerful. Now, during Lent, we might well want to choose some particular spiritual exercises to help us focus that prayerfulness, that mindfulness in our lives. For example, you might want to join us, even just once or twice a week, with either morning prayer or evening prayer, which we do by Zoom. We have sometimes 6 or 7 people joining that, sometimes just a couple of us. But every morning, every afternoon, 8:30 in the morning, 5:30 in the afternoon, there are people coming together from wherever they are, up and down the coast, across town, praying for each other, praying for the parish, praying for those who are sick, and listening to the scriptures and joining our prayers with the prayers of the church. Give it a go. It can't hurt. You can always hit the delete button and say your internet dropped out if you don't like it. The link is usually on the back of the bulletin, although it's not there this week, but I'll make sure I send it out in the email later in the week. Maybe what we need to do is simply take a walk outside, to be away from our devices, out in nature and at home with God. Maybe it's joining in the weekly reflections which are provided for us online from ABM, listening and interacting with people from the Torres Strait, hearing their story of the difference Christian faith made to their culture and to their society. Maybe it's learning to play a musical instrument. Maybe it's learning to sing and join the choir. Maybe it's starting to keep a journal, to write down the questions and the insights which emerge for you during these 40 days. Maybe it's something else. And then there's the lens of giving or engaging. How can our imaginations run through that window? Lent is a time to take some of the money which we would otherwise spend on ourselves and choose instead to give it to somebody else so that we're not spending it on ourselves. And it really doesn't matter how small or how big it is. It's simply the idea that we've thought about it and we've said, yeah, I could use that to do this, but instead I'm going to give it to that project or to this cause or whatever. So one of the ways we encourage you to think about that is to use the opportunity to make a gift at some point during Lent to ABM. And there are actually ABM gift envelopes in today's service booklet, and of course you can make a gift online as well. You may have some other charity you want to give a gift to. That's fine. God does not only work through church organisations, breaking news, okay? So when we support other people who are doing good things, we're actually also supporting God's work. You might decide that actually you just don't have any spare cash, but you could carve out some time, and you could donate some time and some energy to a worthwhile project. It may be something you'd end up really enjoying, but the point is you're choosing not just to soak up all the time for yourself and to allocate some of it to somebody else. Time is, of course, our most precious gift. We never get yesterday back. You might decide to join the Rural Fire Service. You might decide to volunteer at the op shop. You might decide to help with weed control on Susan Island. There are any number of things you could be doing around town and around the cathedral, which would be not only good for our souls, but also good for God's world. There are a zillion ways to give and engage, but the trick, of course, is to be mindful, to do it in a prayerful and centered way, without getting so busy that we lose our sense of God's presence. So think of Lent as an invitation to use our imagination to become more like that person we really want to be. People who slow down and discard some of the pressures to be like this or to do that. People who are attentive to the still, small voice. People who are engaged in God's work in the world. Then, having spent the next 6 weeks in that important spiritual work, we can celebrate Easter with immense joy and great hope. Amen.